welcome to Dialogue. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, has lowered its forecast for global economic growth from 3.4% in 2024 to 2.9% in both 2025 and 2026, partly due to tensions and uncertainties caused by recent U.S. tariffs. Meanwhile, the group expects U.S. growth will slow to just 1.6% this year. What are the key drivers behind this slowdown, and what do these tell us about the global future economic outlook? And what can countries do to navigate the growing uncertainty and maintain economic resilience? Join us for today's discussion from Beijing. I'm Xu Qingduo. Joining us for today's show, Professor Liu Baocheng at the University of International Business and Economics, Professor Iain Begg at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and Anthony Chang, former chief economist of JPMorgan Chase. Welcome to the show. So, Anthony, I will start with you. OECD obviously lowered its forecast for economic growth this year, 2025, and next year. What do you make of it?
I think it's a realistic move because with global trade uncertainty, we know that economic growth is going to slow. Remember that tariffs generally slow economic growth and increase price pressures. And that's exactly what is reflected in the forecast revision by the OECD, both of those factors. We're also seeing some pressure on the financial markets with regard to higher interest rates that are resulting from this global trade uncertainty. And all those factors have certainly played an important role in the OECD forecast revision.
So, Iain, mostly about the big factor behind the slowdown, substantial barriers to trade and heightened policy uncertainty. Policy uncertainty, of course, associated with the tariffs. Is that what you also think of?
Yes, I think there's no doubt that the direct effect of tariffs is to slow growth on its own, because it means you're switching to less productive or less efficient producers if you're forced to change because of the tariff to a domestic producer or some other source. There's an indirect effect of tariffs, which is implicit in what Anthony was saying, which is the uncertainty it creates has an effect on business confidence. And the reason that matters is that decisions about whether either to invest or whether to order a consignment of imports will be affected by not knowing what the trade regime is going to be. It's been reported in the British press, for example, that many exporters, despite the possibility that the UK will be outside the worst of Trump's tariff barriers, will still be affected because US importers don't know whether they will face today's regime or next month's regime. So everything slows down as a result. And there's a further factor, which is monetary policy. If tariffs, as most people expect, cause inflation, monetary policy, especially in the US, is going to be tighter than it would otherwise be. Higher interest rates also create a dampening effect on global economic growth.
Baocheng, of course, we are talking about the trade. We are talking about the growth, but it's closely related to trade. Tariffs is about on the goods or services traded between nations here. And at the same time, we know that globalized world, despite all the divisions right now, we do trade with different countries, different partners here. If there are tariffs, so everybody is affected in this sense. Less trade, probably less growth.
I think this round of economic slowdown is outstanding in that it is not really cyclical, but rather it's being artificially manipulated for political purpose. And that really stimulates more of a nationalistic sentiment, and the people are getting more conservative and hence are also getting synchronized with the protectionist policies that is being implemented. So fundamentally, it is really the trust between nations, between groups of people that are being injured, which is going to have a long-lasting impact. So therefore, when people are switched in an emergency mode, they care far less about economic efficiency, but their own security, and hence decisions are made even at a higher price, both at the state level, at the business level, and also at the consumption level. And what you can see is that the military expenditure around the world has been, surging, while the expenditure on people's livelihood, either it's medical care or the poverty reduction, not to mention the support to those least developed countries through aid, are diminishing. So this is something that's requires full reflection about the human behavior, about the responsibility of politicians, instead of simply looking at economic performance in a lens of economic theory.
So, Iain, it has a lot to do with this geopolitical situation, maybe because of lack of trust. All of a sudden, somehow economic is about the security. Previously we used to talk about the globalization. We talk about interdependence. We depend on each other. That will ensure, there won't be war or conflicts because we rely on each other. But all of a sudden, the interdependence is becoming a problem here.
Very much so, and that is the root of the problem that's been stimulated by the stance of the White House, saying we want to escape from globalization, we want to ensure that things are onshored in the United States. And as soon as that happens, because the US is such a big component of the global economy, it has ramifications for other countries, even China, the second biggest economy, maybe even the biggest economy in the world, depending on how you measure it, cannot simply brush away the potential loss of sales to the United States. And there's another factor that's quite important here, which is that there's much talk about how military expenditure stimulates the economy. It does, but it's a short-term expedient because you can only do it by increasing debt in the absence of taxes coming from other sectors of the economy. So there's a potential overhang of debt which could become a worse problem for the global economy, even though it's not hitting yet.
A good point. We will touch upon that issue later on. Before that, Anthony, obviously the OECD, speaker for the U.S. growth. It seems like the U.S. is the economy that's hit hardest. They say U.S. economy is to experience a sharp slowdown, sliding from 2.8% last year to just 1.6% this year, and 1.5% even slower in 2026. So, I mean, is that a surprise to you, or is that you are expected?
Not a surprise at all. When you have these tariffs, what happens is if all of a sudden now the increase in price is faced by consumers, that means that they have less money to purchase other products, which means it slows down economic growth. So you get those twin effects. You get the higher prices, and you also get the slower economic growth. So what I think is surprising is that they're not telling you that there is a risk of a recession, which, by the way, I don't think the risk of a recession is higher than 25% at this juncture. And if you go to polymarket.com, it's been hovering at around 33 to 35%, and that's down from a peak of probability of a recession of almost 66% in April. So the expectation is, yes, it will slow economic growth, but the expectation is also that these nations will come to some sort of a deal sometime over the next couple of months, heading off a potential recession. Even though economic growth is slowing, it's not slowing to the point where the U.S. is in danger, real serious danger of a recession, or even the global economy. Remember, the global economy, whenever it grows above 2.5%, you could almost take away global recession off the table. But if you are below 2.5%, we're not there yet, then of course we're talking about global recession. So I think that the OECD and other organizations like the IMF are talking about increased risk of slower growth, but it's too early to say global recession or even a US recession.
You are talking about, there's if there are deals to be made in the next 5 weeks before the reprieve period for 3 months ends, I think in early July. And so far, there's a deal with China sort of, hanging in the air. And of course, there's a preliminary deal with the UK. Are we looking at other deals upcoming?
I think we are looking at many deals. Remember that at the beginning, they said 90 deals in 90 days. That's obviously unreasonable.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the 90 days is a self-imposed date. But I think in reality, those dates are going to have to be extended because you're not going to get 90 deals in 90 days. And it's not even clear you're going to get major deals in 90 days. So that is a self-imposed deadline that I think will probably have to be extended.
Yeah, we have to be extended, and of course.
I think even if deals are being struck, whether the credibility of any party is going to be sustainable or reliable, that's something we need to take into consideration.
Uncertainty. So, Anthony, even let's assume there are deals, not even not like 90 deals in 90 days. There are a number of deals. The White House has been talking about this baseline tariffs of 10%. So 10% on every piece of goods from other countries that we're sticking. So that will be increase of the average U.S. effective tariff rate, unprecedented from 2.5% to about 15%. Still, that's the highest since the Second World War. That will be having an impact on the U.S. economy and the global economy, right?
No question. And in fact, I wrote a Substack article on that topic because the president has put a lot of pressure on major retailers like Walmart to absorb the tariffs, Best Buy and Target. And the reality is that if you look at the S&P 500, the forward profit margin expectation is that the profit margins are about 13% roughly. So if you have a 10% tariff, that's basically telling major companies out there to basically wipe out their profits if their profit margin is 13%. And then if you look at some of these retailers that are selling a lot of these imported goods, if you look at these companies, their profit margins are even smaller, close to 3%. So very difficult to absorb these tariffs, which means that they're going to have to pass on the cost. Now, in reality, a lot of companies may be reluctant to say they're going to pass on those higher prices, but they will. And how can they do that? Well, they'll do it quietly, or some of them that are discounting prices will stop discounting, and now all of a sudden, no discount is another way of saying prices go up. Right. So they cannot absorb those tariffs. So that's the reality. And that means that consumers will absorb them, which means that it explains why consumer sentiment is so low.
Mm-hmm. Well, Baocheng, that's exactly the case, I guess. OECD projects U.S. inflation could rise to nearly 4% at the end of this year, up from the current 2.3%. That of course, will create some problem if the inflation continue to climb. President Trump has, he said during the campaign, he will bring down the inflation. Obviously, now the inflation is growing. That will be some pressure, some impact on economy and also on politics even.
OECD, I do not really read that they take into consideration the huge stockpile that was already accumulated before or in anticipation of the reciprocal tariff. And now when the inventory is running low, and so there's going to be further price hike that's over there. So therefore, inflation rate will be more and more visibly felt. And then the bargaining of in the business community is almost over. Now it is a time as how to disperse those costs to the end consumers, because nobody really wants to do business below cost.
Right. So Iain, earlier you mentioned about the inflation. Of course, if you look at the major retailers in the U.S. like Nike, Target, Walmart, and Best Buy, are already warning of tariff-driven price increases. At the end of this year, 4%, nearly 4%. And then there's no interest rate cut. So there's both business and consumers will be affected, right?
Undoubtedly, I think that's what Anthony was saying earlier, that these retailers, if they cannot absorb the cost, are going to have to increase prices, and American households will notice this. And there's one other factor that we haven't mentioned yet, which I think is important to put into this discussion, and that is that the US has a significant surplus on trade in services.
Right.
If you think of some of the tech giants in the US, they are major exporters to the rest of the world. But you're also seeing in some countries a degree of backlash against the US. For example, European tourists cutting back on their plans to make tourist trips to the United States, which in practice is a US export. So that we need to look beyond the tariffs on goods to look at the wider picture affecting the global economy. And given that services are a much bigger component of most economies than manufacturers, it's an element of this entire story that we need to concentrate on beyond what Trump does with particular tariffs, be it steel, automobiles, or something else.
Well, adding to that probably is the international students. Maybe they're not going to do something serious against the international students, but certainly the fear is there, or the concern is there. Young kids from other countries, when they plan their further study, probably they have a second thought about going to the US, Ian.
They're going to have,
yes, and especially when you see what's going on with Harvard, where
Yes.
the assault on international students is something that clearly none of them expected. So that's why I'm using this background. They can come to LSE and enjoy London.
Yeah, so I receive, as a professor, I receive constant inquiries from my students that is it still possible to study in the United States? I always tell them you need to have a third and fourth thought.
Second thought is not enough.
So yeah, that's the consideration, because you may not really end up in a graduation diploma, and then you also risk deportation, and there's also increase on the entity list of the Chinese universities. So this is really going to have a very spooky effect over a long term, even if they suddenly reverse this policy, and the psychological injury is there, that requires a long time to recover.
Right. But anyway, speak of the bill, the spending bill, Anthony. There's a strong voice, obviously, from Elon Musk. He called it a pork-filled congressional spending bill. That is, disgusting abomination. Is he a fiscal conservative? I mean, why is he strongly against the bill?
Well, there's no question that Elon Musk is a fiscal conservative. And in fact, he's joined by others, Ron Johnson, the senator, and of course, Ron Paul. They're all upset because this president ran on a platform of potentially paying down the debt. And yet this bill, which I have read, 1,038 pages,
Not easy.
basically says, yeah, not easy. It's going to increase the national debt ceiling by over $4 trillion. So if you're saying you're going to reduce the debt, but you're asking for permission to increase the debt by over $4 trillion, there's an inconsistency there. And of course, Elon Musk, whether you support him or not, he was trying to lower government expenditures and lower the deficit. And now all of a sudden, it's going in a different direction. That's why he's upset. And that's why a few senators are also upset. In the House, obviously, it was just very close, but strong enough to get it passed. But it's going to encounter some real severe turbulence in the Senate until pressure is imposed. And remember the point that you can impose greater pressure in the House because those members are elected more frequently. But in the Senate, where they're not elected frequently, there's less pressure that you can impose.
What's the likelihood of it gets approved in the Senate, Anthony?
I think if the likelihood of it being approved in its current state is very low, maybe 20%. But I think it will have to be revamped and changed. Some of those things that are said about the bill are incorrect. Like, for example, they say the low-income individuals, because there's no tips, they're going to do great. Well, 37% of those low-income individuals that earn below $22,000 pay no federal tax. So even though you now say no federal tax on tips for a few years, not even for the full 10 years, as I recall when I read the bill, they don't benefit from that. And then you're going to take 8.7 million people and just throw them off the rolls of receiving health care through Medicaid. So net, those low-income individuals lose money because they reduce the benefits on health care, and they'll also reduce the benefits on food assistance or food stamps. So it's not true that those low-income individuals get more. But answer to your question directly is, yes, the bill, I think, eventually will pass, but it will have to be revised. Remember that after the Senate changes a few things, it has to go back to the House to get it approved again.
Yeah, to negotiate. Let's assume, likely the content will be there and it will be approved. What's the impact on the economy? So that will stimulate the economic growth, despite the increase of debt?
Well, yes, it will stimulate growth to some extent, but not fully, because remember that to the extent that you go ahead and extend tax cuts, that stimulus is already there. So that's not an incremental gain to the economy. The other things are the incremental gains in the economy, and some of those may go away or certainly may be revamped. But just the pure extension of tax cuts is not a stimulus to the economy. But they're doing it because if you didn't extend those cuts, then it will be contractionary to the economy. And in a world where the economy is no doubt going to slow down in 2025 and potentially in 2026, the last thing this administration wants to do ahead of midterm elections is to slow down the economy further.
So, that's why probably the strong push for the spending bill. Iain, now here there's a concern, of course. You have this, if you take a look at the consumer sentiment is low, or worsened according to the latest survey by U.S. University, and also business planning are being affected because it's very difficult to do long-term planning and investment, and of course everything is getting more expensive with higher prices. People are talking about the possibility of a stagflation, which of course for our viewers means when inflation rises and the economy slows. How likely is that?
Well, in relative terms, it will be more inflation and less growth than there would otherwise have been. But the definition of stagflation is very elastic. You don't quite know what level of inflation and what level of growth constitutes stagflation. So it's better to look at it in terms of the individual components and say inflation worse, growth worse. And they constitute a shift in the direction of stagflation. There's one other factor which is going to start to bear more heavily on the US economy, and that is the cost of financing the debt. Because if interest rates stay relatively high and are not reduced because inflation starts to grow again, then the burden of financing the US debt will go up in cash terms. It's a first call on the US Treasury. And that first call on the US Treasury will add to the squeeze that the two other speakers have been talking about on the recipients who are relatively low income from things like food stamps, from cuts in Medicare. The availability of money will go down because more has to be sent in interest payments. And this in turn may have effects on other parts of the world who hold American debt, particularly Japan and China. They have to consider their response to a US debt which increases. Do China and Japan in particular continue to support by buying US bonds, or do they try to shift away from it, which could undermine the strength of the dollar? These are longer term effects of this strategic approach, but they should not be neglected.
But anyway, take a look at the outlook of the international economy. Baocheng, Pereira, the OECD's chief economist, said countries urgently needed to strike deals that would lower trade barriers. But it seems like we are very difficult to the point of unable to strike deals that will lower the barriers and increase trade among nations.
We have deals. Since the Second World War, GATT and then WTO really worked pretty much to build a consensus around the world. The interdependence and free flow of goods and services are there to service everybody. Even if some nations gain bigger and some nations gain smaller, but the general gain is already there. But because of such a sort of tariff, and WTO recently also forecast down by 1.5% of the global trade growth simply because of the reciprocal tariff. And right now, so the U.S. has been playing a leadership role in proposing those rule-based international order and defending it. Now they are there to dismantle this whole rule-based system and return to more of a jungle law type of international collaboration. So therefore, we can only see that there's going to be regional integration within the general framework of global fragmentation. And when many of those nations, they try to reinvent the wheels to move forward, even though they have the general intention, they may not really build the right type of consensus that is better fitted for a larger part of the entire region or a global basis. So this is something that leaves further uncertainty to business decisions.
With that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.
What's behind the next door? What motivates us to find the truth? To understand the world, we must see it from different angles. Never stop searching. Go deeper. Go further. Be open-minded. Be engaged. Open the door through dialogue, where ideas do matter.